So I know this was brought up. Some of these scenarios are geared to where they don't give you a huge amount of information. Sometimes you don't need that information. Sometimes I do give you a lot of information and you still don't need that information and you have to weed through some of that stuff. I'm not being mean and I'm not purposefully laying red herrings, but I'm oftentimes recounting how that information might be really given to an IT department. So for instance, you work for a corporation, they have a large building, somebody is moving into a vacant office, and this is the scenario, a vacant office. Some of this is just assumed. You're working for a large corporation, there's a building that they own, and there's a vacant office or available office in some way that somebody is moving into or multiple people are moving into. And so in this situation, there is a pre-existing network that you have control over, and so it should be just plug and play. Well, when you get into the office, you find that there is only one network jack. As in the case is with so many older buildings, you're lucky sometimes if you have network in there. And so what do? What is your course of action? So it all depends on your time frame. If they go, yeah, eventually we're going to be moving somebody into this office in about a month or so, and we need to move 2 people into here, and oh yeah, and they need a couple of printers, and they need computers, and they need their phones, etc., etc., etc. And you can kind of go, oh wow, there's only one network jack in here, so we need to address that issue. You can then plan and say, okay, I should probably pull cables, because that's the long-term solution, pull cables into that office, and you can do so properly through the walls, ceiling, however it's done, making sure that you're avoiding EMI, and you're using the proper cables and things. So that would be the long-term solution. Really, if people are going to be moving into that office and multiple people are going to be there for a long period of time, you want to provide a long-term solution at whatever point that may be. So now, let me throw this scenario at you. You got to move these people into the office. You get in there, you find there's only one network jack, same type of scenario, but the time has changed. Instead of a couple of months, it's got to happen today. They're coming in today. They need their computers up and running today. And this is a very common thing with IT. A lot of people just don't think ahead and go, yeah, I'm going to need a computer. Yeah, I'm going to need a phone, etc. They just assume that, well, when I say I'm moving into an office, that a lot of this stuff just kind of magically happens. A lot of times, my boss, the director, is not even aware that this sort of thing is happening. I've gotten stopped in the hallways and, hey, how come so-and-so doesn't have a computer? And I'm like, I didn't know that they needed one. Where are they? And they're in this office. Well, that office was vacant. Well, it's not now. Okay, well, we'll get right on that. Go back, report to my boss, hey, this person has moved into this office. They need their equipment moved or whatever. And we scramble the team. Such is the case oftentimes. And you get to that office and it's like, great, yeah, there's only one network jack and we've got 2 people moving in here and each one has a computer, each one has a VoIP phone, and each one has a printer. A lot of VoIP phones thankfully have a second jack in the back, so it has an input and an output for the computer. It does act like a hub though, so kind of keep that in mind. But in a situation where you're in a available jack crunch, you don't have available jacks, you kind of do the best you can. So let's say you've got to move people into that office, that pulling cable across to the closest IDF is probably not feasible because that's going to take a little bit of time, and again, they need this now. So what do? So that means installing an extra piece of equipment in that room to provide them with network ports. So you make sure that one jack is active, back on the switch. It's connected to the appropriate VLANs. In this part, the appropriate VLANs will be determined by the type of equipment you put in the room. So you could do a hub. Hub is just a repeater. It just repeats one signal. So you'll only need one untagged VLAN on that port. The problem with a hub, as you learned, it creates a collision domain. Collision domain is where you have multiple devices talking at one time. Now, They've come up with standards to help prevent some of that, but you still get collisions, you still have that issue. So then there are unmanaged switches, which are pretty much just a smart hub. It doesn't create a complete collision domain, but I've still seen collisions happen on those because it's not a managed switch, it's just forwarding traffic. And it kind of does so in a manner that's not always the best. Again, it acts like a hub a lot of times. And I've still seen issues to where you get multiple devices on a unmanaged switch that they begin to cause network issues. Hubs are also notorious for overheating, and some of the ports will go out depending on the company and the type of hub that it is, or the type of unmanaged switch that it is. The benefit is they're cheap. They're easy to install, so oftentimes your department will have multiple hubs or unmanaged switches on hand, and you just go grab one, you plug it into the wall, and away you go. You've got multiple network ports available. Again, another issue is it's only one VLAN that's being broadcast, only one subnet. So if you've got your computers on one subnet and your printers on another subnet, you're going to have to find a balance to where they're all on the same subnet. Or decide that, the printers don't need to be networked. I don't necessarily advise that because as the network systems admin, a lot of times you will be required, or even your network techs will be required to maintain printers, and the best way to do that is to have them plugged into the network. But you do the best you can. So then the other option was to actually install a switch in that room. So there are different size switches. You can do 8-port switch, 12-port switch, 24-port switch, 48-port switch, etc. The problem with the larger switches, they're more expensive. You don't oftentimes have a large number of spare switches laying around, so the chances of having a big switch laying around is probably pretty slim. And they're also noisy. Plus, it's kind of a waste of resources. I mean, you're really only going to have maybe 4 to 6 devices plugged into this thing. And if it's a 48-port switch, I mean, you're really not using that resource properly. It can be done, and it can be done as a temporary solution. Just be careful because temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent. So you could put a switch in that room. Let's say you've got a little 8-port switch, which are oftentimes fanless, so they're quiet. You stick it off to the side of the desk to where it's out of view. You've run your cables to it around the desk. Everything is hidden nicely. That is definitely something a lot of you have brought up. Watch your cables, make sure there's nothing stringing across the floor. One of the things I hate is walking into a room that we've set up to see cables just spaghettied all over the place. So all of us in our department are pretty OCD about making sure that our cables are hidden, tacked down, and wrapped up in some way. So that way they are out of the way. They're easy to maintain, they're not getting damaged, and if they have to run across the room, we do our best to make sure that they run through ceilings, around the walls, some way to keep out of foot traffic. But if you have to run it across the floor, we're very diligent about making sure it's contained and that, it's taped down and a rug goes over it or something. Just so that way it's not as bad of a trip hazard. Side rant there. So let's say you've got your little 8-port switch beside the desk, everything's tucked away, plugged in, you're good to go. What's nice about that little switch is it is managed. So you can split up ports on different subnets, different VLANs for your printers and your computers and whatever else you have in that room. So that is definitely an option. Again, it can be kind of an expensive option though. So depending on the time crunch and what equipment you have available and how long this is going to be, that sometimes determines the type of equipment you put in that room. Side note, you can do something temporary like that, and then on an off day, schedule it to where nobody's in the office or at least in the area, and run some cables over to the IDF. Give yourself some more drops to that room. Industry standard is moving towards 3 to 4 drops per room. I've seen more drops per room depending on what the room is going to be used for and the size of the room. So a minimum 3 to 4 drops for a smallish room, a smallish office. There's just so much equipment these days that can be networked. Having one network jack in a room is not acceptable anymore. So, but then again, sometimes you just don't have a choice. That's what's there, that's what you've got. And it's going to take a while and you might even have to get permission and so forth to run cable. So, maybe make that a distant goal. The other option people mentioned was having a router that they plug into the room, which is a viable option. The issue with plugging a router into the room is normally in an enterprise network like this, you have big routers, they're very expensive, and they're usually in your data center or your MDF. And they are handling the traffic that goes out of the organization and, of course, comes in. It connects you to the internet, in other words, or it connects you to the WAN. So having a router like that in this type of situation, that's not going to be feasible. Sometimes you do what you got to do with the equipment that you have. If you have a spare router laying around and you go, this is only going to get us through until the end of the week, and I don't have any other piece of equipment and we need this now, then maybe that's the way to go. And if you know how to configure that router so it's not going to cause issues on the network, then by all means do so. Because a router does have routing tables. It keeps track of where things are at, where it's going. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but you just have to be aware of the type of information it's gathering, because people mentioned security issues. You definitely want to lock your network device down to the point that ports not in use are disabled. Of course, it's been password protected, the whole bit. So that thing is harder to hack, put it that way. Again, routers can be expensive. Then somebody said, well, just a home router. Go down to Walmart and get yourself a little Netgear home router. They're only $30 or whatever, and just plug it in. The little home routers, that's okay, but little home routers come with their own. They're a router, they house like a DHCP server. It can be done. It can totally be done. But what happens is you create an ad hoc network, which means that you have your enterprise level network. You plug something like that in, it then creates its own little network that you have to maintain, you have to be aware of. And it becomes another headache in of itself. Because that little network, people can start adding to it, or it's there. It's one of those things that you forget about it and it poses a security risk. It's not part of the main network. And so you definitely want to steer clear from ad hoc networks. That's why network admins get a little snippy sometimes, all the time, when people bring in their own devices and plug it into our wall. They unplug their computer because hopefully your network admin, or you as the network admin, has disabled switch ports not in use and wall jacks not in use are not patched in. Only those in use are patched in and plugged into a switch with an active port. So somebody knows that, they come along, they unplug their computer from the wall, they plug their router into it, they plug their computer into the router, and now they've got multiple ports. And if it's a wireless router, they've created their own little wired ad hoc network, and they can plug in their own personal devices. They have their own printer that they've purchased and they put it on their desk and they plug it all in, and they know how to configure stuff. After all, they've taken some computer courses, and they get their own little network set up. That is a nightmare waiting to happen. Actually, it's already happened. It's a headache waiting to happen. You can't control the security of that little ad hoc network. You can't control the devices on that ad hoc network a lot of times. Because the little home routers, they NAT themselves. They prevent a lot of times inbound traffic without a tunnel. So again, you can't control the devices on that network. It becomes an issue. You can't control that company computer on that network. And if something goes south, which A lot of times it does. They download a virus or whatever, and it spreads to their little ad hoc network, and then guess what? It finds its way out into your network. And, you're ultimately held responsible for that. So, as a network admin, there are times I take a walk around campus, I'm checking for ad hoc networks, either on my network, my actual, line. If none of our systems have picked it up, a lot of times it's good just to, do a quick check, get up, stretch, and, walk around, or, I'll have my phone, has a special app on it that I can, scan for various wireless signals. And if I'm picking up odd wireless signals, usually that means there's an ad hoc network somewhere, because where we're located, there aren't any other wireless signals around besides us. So if I see something else, including printers, by the way, printers are notorious that you purchase, if they're not configured properly, they're broadcasting themselves all over the place. And so they pose a security risk. Anyway, back to the point of using routers. It's not a good idea to use a router in that type of situation. Somebody did mention using wireless. Why not just plug in a wireless AP and make everything wireless? It's not a bad idea. Oftentimes that office is probably saturated with wireless networking anyway. You don't have to plug in an AP. So why not just use wireless? That's great if you have the wireless adapters, if your computers are capable of doing that, either through the wireless adapters or because they're equipped that way, and if your phones are equipped that way. And most printers are also, so sometimes you can get away with wireless. That's a good idea. Keep that in the back of your mind. Can we do this wirelessly? A lot of times you have no choice. We were called to put an office in a room. I still have no idea what the room was really used for. It was kind of one of those rooms that's next to a boiler room. So it's meant for storage, but there was no storage in it. And they wanted to use it as an office, but it was hard walls, hard lid. So, and no jacks anywhere. I think there might have been a power outlet or two. No data jacks, solid walls. We were going to have to drill through the wall in order to install something, and a hard lid means it was not a drop ceiling, it was a sealed room for fireproofing purposes. Again, probably because it was next to the boiler room. Again, I'm not totally sure what that room was used for, but we were called to put an office in there, and it's like, wow, that's going to be interesting. What do? Wireless. We actually had a wireless signal in there. It had enough coverage in that area to get wireless signals, so that's what we had to do. Again, there was enough power, just no network. So keep wireless in the back of your mind. Great suggestion. I think that about covers it. You all, again, had excellent ideas, great input. There was not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It was just sharing of ideas. What would you do in this type of situation? And again, I didn't necessarily give you a whole lot of information. It was just kind of thrown out there in order to kind of make you think big and make you think, what would I do in this situation? What would I do in this situation? What would I do in this situation? That way, when you do get into these situations in real life, if you haven't already, you have this stuff in the back of your mind. You go, oh yeah, I could probably do this. You'll be amazed that even though you might forget a lot of this stuff, a couple of months from now, heck, a couple of weeks from now, it's still there. It's created a foundation. It's made enough of an impression that it'll pop up, even subconsciously, to where you go, how about I do this? And so that's what these exercises are geared for, just to kind of make you think outside the box, think outside the textbook, and go, okay, I've learned this. How do I use it? So anyway, great input. Hope you have a good week.